The inheritance felt less like a blessing and more like a shroud, particularly for Evan. Ashworth Grange, nestled deep within the forgotten hollows of Crow's End, stood as a monument to decay. Its ancient stone walls were perpetually damp, its grand, dust-shrouded halls echoing with the sighs of departed seasons. His grandmother, God rest her weary soul, had always warned him about places that felt too still, too old, places where the earth itself seemed to remember things best left forgotten. Her last words, whispered on the breath like dry leaves, were to keep the old texts close and the light within you stronger. He'd found a crumbling, leather-bound grimoire among her things, like a collection of protective chants and arcane symbols, bound in faded gold, a relic of a time when faith was a shield against unseen terrors. He dismissed it as sentimental until now. For the first few days, the silence was merely unsettling. The old house braved with the drafts, groaning like an old man. But then, the stillness began to twist into something else. Faint clinking sounds, like distant chains dragging across stone, would drift from the unoccupied upper floors. Whispers, thin as spider's silk, seemed to coil around the corners of his hearing, just beyond comprehension. He'd attribute it to the wind, the creaks of an old structure settling, but the rationalizations grew thin. One night, a distinct murmur began to emanate from the floorboards directly beneath his bedroom. It wasn't the house settling. It was a low, resonant thrum, like many voices speaking in unison, yet too faint to decipher. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at his skin. He remembered his grandmother's grimoire, tucked away in his travel bag. With trembling hands, he retrieved it, flipping through the brittle pages until he found a section marked Verses of Warding. He began to read aloud, his voice wavering, the ancient words feeling strange on his tongue. As the incantation filled the oppressive air, the murmuring beneath him receded, fading like a nightmare at dawn. He exhaled a ragged gasp and slumped back, the fragile peace lasting only until the first faint rays of morning. But the reprieve was fleeting. The following nights were worse. Shadows, too deep for the moonlight, stretched and writhed outside his window, moving with an unnatural fluidity. Once, a pale, indistinct form, like a wisp of fog caught in the moonlight, drifted past the glass, its outline hinting at a humanoid shape. He saw it only for a fleeting second, but the image seared itself into his mind. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. Desperate, on the third night, he decided to perform a vigil. He would invoke the protected energies from the grimoire, facing whatever malevolence haunted Ashworth Grange. He positioned himself in the center of the drawing room, surrounded by flickering candles, the heavy tome open on the antique table before him. He began to recite the most potent of the warding verses, his voice gaining strength with each word, transforming from a whisper to a resolute chant. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the house around him came alive with a terrible energy. The clinking returned, louder, more distinct, like countless rusty shackles being dragged. Footsteps, heavy and numerous, stomped through the darkened corridors, ascending the grand staircase, converging. It sounded as if an unseen multitude was gathering just beyond the drawing room door. Their murmurs returned, no longer faint, but a guttural chorus of groans, gasps, and slithering sounds, a symphony of torment and malice. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the silence of his fear. He pressed his eye against the antique keyhole, a desperate, morbid curiosity overriding his terror. What he saw would forever scar his soul. Through the narrow slit, he beheld the ghastly tableau. The grand hall, usually shrouded in shadow, was filled with a horrific congregation. Rotting forms, some skeletal, some bloated, some missing limbs or heads, swayed in the spectral moonlight filtering through the high windows. There were faces frozen in eternal screams, empty eye sockets staring into the void, bodies half-eaten by unseen predators, their flesh sloughing off bones. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent, macabre assembly, swaying with an eerie, rhythmic motion, as if awaiting a signal. He recoiled, a strangled cry catching in his throat, stumbling back from the door. He clutched the grimoire to his chest, its ancient pages now feeling like his only anchor to reality. He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut, repeating the wording verses in a frantic whisper, pleading for salvation from whatever unspeakable horror had risen to confront him. Then a voice, deep and resonant, yet utterly devoid of human warmth, tore through the grotesque stillness. It was a sound dredged from the deepest pits of the abyss, a guttural roar that vibrated through the very foundations of the house. "The midnight rite begins," it bellowed, the words seeming to claw their way into his mind. At the sound of that monstrous voice, the assembled dead stirred. Their collective murmurs intensified, transforming into a cacophony of moans, guttural prayers, and the sickening sound of decaying flesh rubbing against itself. It was the sound of 1,000 nightmares given voice, a chorus of despair and malevolence. They were performing their own horrific ritual, their silent swaying replaced by a grotesque mimicry of worship. They then collapsed to his knees, his mind screaming, the protective words pouring from his lips in a desperate torrent. The air grew colder, heavy with the stench of grave soil and ancient decay. He could hear their ragged breaths, their unseen movements, feel their malevolent gazes fixed upon him. Even through the thick oak door, the leader's voice rose again, another bestial roar, and the entity's ritual grew frantic, their collective wails rising in a terrifying crescendo, pushing him to the brink of madness. He didn't know how long he stayed there, a trembling husk, clinging to the fading whispers of his grandmother's protection. He recited until his throat was raw, until his voice cracked and failed, until the very essence of fear consumed him. Then, as if a switch had been thrown, the cacophony began to ebb. The guttural prayers diminished, the clinking of chains faded, and the oppressive chill began to lift. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth spread through the room. He heard a gentle voice, like the caress of a forgotten memory, a whisper of peace that seemed to cut through the lingering dread. Slowly, hesitantly, he opened his eyes. The room was bathed in the pale, soft light of dawn, the candles having long since guttered out. A heavy atmosphere of dread had lifted, leaving behind only the lingering scent of old dust and the faint aroma of decay. The house was silent again, but it was a different silence, or a silent emptiness, devoid of the malevolent presence that had held him captive. He didn't hesitate. Without even collecting his few belongings, he stumbled out of Ashworth Grange, never looking back. The morning air, though cold, felt like a balm against his ravaged senses. He walked until the manor was a distant, forgotten silhouette against the rising sun. Weeks later, after finding solace in a small, nameless village miles away, he learned the truth from a hushed local legend. Ashworth Grange had been built centuries ago upon an unmarked burial ground, a forgotten mass grave from a devastating plague. The original inhabitants had vanished without a trace, and every subsequent owner had either fled in terror or met an inexplicable, horrific end. The local folk whispered of a midnight congregation that gathered when the veil between worlds thins, performing ancient rites for their eternal torment. It then was just another witness to their unholy assembly, a survivor of the dead's unceasing prayer,